Some folks say money can't buy happiness, but they've never tried being rich and lonely at the same time. Clayton Blackwood learned this truth the hard way, sitting alone in his grand ranch house every night, counting gold while his heart stayed empty. His fortune could buy anything except the one thing he wanted most: someone to share it with. When Miss Eleanor Harper stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a worn suitcase and big dreams of teaching the town's children, she had no idea her life was about to change forever. Clayton made her an offer that shocked everyone. "I'll share my fortune, and you'll share my bed." But when survival forces them together, will a deal born of desperation bloom into something neither expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Silver Creek in shades of amber and dust, its rays catching the weathered buildings that lined the main street like tired sentinels keeping watch over another day in the high desert of Nevada Territory. Eleanor Harper stepped down from the stagecoach, her worn leather boots meeting the hard-packed earth, with a determination that belied the meager contents of her carpet bag. The teaching certificate, tucked carefully between her few dresses, represented everything she owned of value in this world, a piece of paper that declared her qualified to shape young minds, though it couldn't guarantee her a place to do so. The driver handed down her trunk with more care than its battered appearance warranted, and Eleanor pressed a precious dime into his weathered palm, despite knowing she could hardly afford the gesture. In her previous life back in Philadelphia, such kindness would have been automatic, expected. Here in the territories, every coin mattered, every decision carried weight that could determine whether she would eat that week or sleep with a roof over her head. Silver Creek spread before her like a promise written in timber and adobe, its single main street flanked by establishments that served the practical needs of frontier life. Murphy's General Store occupied the largest building, its porch sagging under the weight of barrels and crates that spoke of goods hauled hundreds of miles across dangerous terrain. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood opposite, its bat-wing doors already swinging with the day's first customers, miners and ranch hands seeking liquid courage for whatever challenges awaited them. But it was the sight at the far end of town that stopped Eleanor's breath. Rising like something conjured from a fever dream, the Blackwood ranch house commanded the landscape with architectural grandeur that seemed almost defiant in its refinement. 3 stories of carefully crafted timber and stone, with wraparound porches that caught the morning light and threw it back in golden waves. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see the careful attention to detail-carved railings, painted shutters, and windows that sparkled with cleanliness that spoke of household staff and careful maintenance. "First time seeing the Blackwood place?" asked a voice behind her. Eleanor turned to find a woman about her own age, though the sun and wind of frontier life had etched lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure. She wore a practical calico dress with sleeves rolled to her elbows and an apron that bore the honest stains of morning cooking. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," the woman continued, extending a work-roughened hand. "My husband Tom runs the livery stable. You must be the new schoolteacher we've been hearing about." "Eleanor Harper," she replied, accepting the handshake and finding unexpected strength in Sarah's grip. "Though I haven't actually secured a position yet. I came hoping there might be work for someone with teaching credentials." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful as she studied Eleanor's face. "Oh, there's need, that's certain. Most of the children hereabouts can barely read their own names, and their parents work too hard to teach them much beyond how to survive. But finding the means to pay a teacher proper wages, that's where the difficulty lies." Eleanor's heart sank slightly, though she tried to keep her disappointment from showing. The journey west had consumed most of her savings, and the letter of recommendation from her previous position couldn't be converted into ready currency. "Perhaps there's other work available?" "I'm not afraid of honest labor." "There's always work for willing hands," Sarah agreed. "Mrs. Coleman at the boarding house could probably use help with washing and mending. Doesn't pay much, but it includes room and board. You'll want to speak with her directly, though she can be particular about her tenants." As if summoned by their conversation, a severe-looking woman emerged from a two-story building that Eleanor recognized as the boarding house by its multiple windows and commercial air. Mrs. Coleman possessed the bearing of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about character. Her steel-grey hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows permanently. "Miss Harper, I presume?" Mrs. Coleman's voice carried the authority of someone who had managed difficult situations for many years. "I received word you might be seeking accommodation. I run a respectable establishment. No drinking, no loud conversation after 8 o'clock, and rent paid weekly in advance." Eleanor calculated quickly in her head, weighing her remaining funds against the unknown duration of her job search. "Your terms seem reasonable. Might I inquire about the possibility of earning my keep through domestic work?" Mrs. Coleman's expression softened slightly, recognizing the careful pride that prevented Eleanor from begging despite obvious financial strain. "I could use help with laundry and room maintenance. It wouldn't cover full rent, but we might work out an arrangement." The negotiation continued in the practical language of frontier commercer duties clearly defined, expectations established, and payment schedules agreed upon with handshakes that carried the weight of legal contracts. Eleanor found herself settled into a small but clean room on the second floor, with a window that looked out toward the mysterious grandeur of the Blackwood Ranch. That evening, as she unpacked her few belongings and arranged her precious books on the room's single shelf, Eleanor became aware of being watched. She couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were observing her movements, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. When she moved to the window to draw the curtains, she caught a glimpse of a solitary figure on horseback, silhouetted against the evening sky on the ridge that overlooked the town. Clayton Blackwood sat astride his favorite mount, a coal-black stallion named Midnight, and studied the boarding house where the new schoolteacher had taken residence. From this distance, he could make out little more than her silhouette moving about the lamplit room, but something about her purposeful movements intrigued him. Most newcomers to Silver Creek spent their first evening drinking away their doubts at the saloon or collapsed in exhaustion from the journey. This woman seemed to be organizing, planning, preparing for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. He had heard about her arrival, of course. In a town of fewer than 300 souls, news traveled faster than wildfire, and the arrival of an educated single woman had generated considerable discussion. Some expressed hope that she might finally provide proper schooling for their children. Others worried about the disruption an outsider might bring to their carefully balanced community dynamics. Clayton's own interest surprised him. For 3 years since Martha's death, he had maintained careful distance from the social fabric of Silver Creek, providing financial support when needed, but avoiding personal entanglements that might lead to expectation or obligation. His wealth made him a target for matchmaking schemes and business propositions, and he had grown skilled at deflecting both with polite but firm disinterest. Yet something about this particular newcomer had drawn him from his self-imposed isolation. Perhaps it was the straightness of her posture as she had stepped from the stagecoach, or the careful way she had counted coins before paying the driver. Whatever the cause, Clayton found himself curious about the woman who would attempt to bring learning to a town that measured value primarily in practical terms. The gold pocket watch in his vest, his father's watch, inherited along with the ranch and the fortune that mining had provided, chimed the hour. 9 o'clock meant the respectable citizens of Silver Creek would be settling into evening routines, while the less respectable would be gathering momentum for whatever entertainment the night might provide. Clayton had no interest in either category, but neither could he bring himself to return immediately to the empty rooms that awaited him. Instead, he dismounted and walked Midnight slowly along the ridge, allowing both horse and rider to process the day's observations. The ranch house below them glowed with warm light from multiple windows, but Clayton knew that illumination concealed rather than revealed the loneliness that pervaded those carefully appointed rooms. Money had purchased comfort, security, and beauty, but it could not populate empty chairs or provide conversation to fill silent evenings. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find reason to visit town. Perhaps he would stop by Murphy's store for supplies that weren't urgently needed, or check on the progress of various business concerns that didn't require immediate attention. Certainly he wouldn't be seeking introduction to the new schoolteacher that would be presumptuous and inappropriate. But if circumstances happened to provide an opportunity for observation, perhaps conversation, well, a man couldn't be blamed for natural curiosity about newcomers to his community. The thought brought the first smile to his face in longer than he cared to remember. 3 weeks into her stay in Silver Creek, Eleanor had established a routine that balanced her domestic duties at the boarding house with her growing efforts to assess the educational needs of the local children. She had discovered 12 youngsters between the ages of 6 and 14 who possessed varying degrees of literacy, from complete inability to read to rudimentary skills that suggested sporadic home instruction. Their parents expressed cautious interest in formal schooling, though always with the caveat that children's labor remained essential to family survival. Eleanor had begun conducting informal lessons in the boarding house parlor during afternoon hours when Mrs. Coleman's other tenants were occupied with their own pursuits. She used her precious collection of Books McGuffey's Readers, a worn arithmetic primer, and several volumes of classic literature to introduce the children to the basics of reading, writing, and mathematical calculation. The work brought her deep satisfaction, even as it highlighted the challenges facing anyone who hoped to establish formal education in a frontier community. The morning that would change everything began with Mrs. Coleman's sharp knock on Eleanor's door, accompanied by a tone that suggested unpleasant business ahead. Eleanor opened the door to find her landlady holding an official-looking envelope, her expression grave. "This came for you yesterday evening," Mrs. Coleman said, extending the envelope with obvious reluctance. "I hoped it might be correspondence from family, but the return address suggests otherwise." Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the formal script and legal terminology that marked the document as an eviction notice. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the carefully worded text that informed her of her obligation to vacate the premises within 1 week due to accumulated unpaid rent. The domestic work she had been performing had helped, but it hadn't been sufficient to cover her full expenses, and the gap had grown larger each week despite her careful economizing. "Mrs. Coleman," Eleanor began, but the older woman raised a hand to stop her. "I've let it go as long as I could, dear. You're a good worker and decent company, but I can't run this establishment on good intentions. The other tenants pay their rent in full and on time, and it wouldn't be fair to them if I made exceptions." Eleanor understood the logic even as it threatened to destroy her carefully constructed new life. She had no family to turn to, no resources beyond her teaching certificate and the few possessions she had brought west. Returning to Philadelphia was impossible both financially and for reasons she preferred not to examine too closely. She was, quite literally, trapped between her past and an uncertain future. The situation grew worse when she arrived at the informal school session that afternoon to find only 3 children waiting instead of the usual 8. The remaining youngsters appeared uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze with the peculiar shame that children display when forced to participate in adult disappointments. "Where are the others?" Eleanor asked gently. 8-year-old Timothy Morrison, the brightest of her students, looked at his shoes before answering. "Pa says we can't come anymore. Says there's no point learning book stuff when there ain't going to be a proper school anyway." Eleanor's stomach clenched with understanding. News of her financial difficulties had apparently spread through the close-knit community, and parents were withdrawing their children rather than invest time and energy in lessons that might disappear without warning. She couldn't blame them for their practicality, even as it felt like watching her dreams crumble in real time. That evening, she sat in her room writing letters to schools in distant towns, hoping to find a position that would allow her to start over somewhere else. The process felt like admitting defeat, abandoning not only her own hopes, but the children who had begun to discover the joy of reading and the power of numbers to make sense of their world. She was startled from her letter writing by a soft knock on her door. Expecting Mrs. Coleman with additional unwelcome news, She was surprised to find Sarah Mitchell standing in the hallway, her expression sympathetic but determined. "Eleanor, might we talk privately?" Eleanor invited her in, grateful for any human companionship that didn't involve financial obligations or professional disappointments. Sarah settled into the room's single chair, while Eleanor perched on the edge of the bed, both women maintaining the careful courtesy that frontier life demanded even in times of crisis. "I heard about your troubles." Sarah began without preamble. "Tom and I talked it over, and we might have a suggestion, though it's not something I'd normally recommend to a respectable young woman." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "I'm listening." "Clayton Blackwood has been asking questions about you around town, casual-like, but persistent. Wants to know about your teaching methods, your plans for a school, how you're settling into Silver Creek life. Tom thinks he might be interested in providing financial backing for education in the community." "That would be wonderful," Eleanor said, though something in Sarah's tone suggested complications ahead. "It would be if that's all he had in mind." Sarah chose her words carefully. "But Clayton Blackwood is a lonely man, with more money than sense and no family to spend it on. Word is, he's considering making you a proposition that goes beyond funding a schoolhouse." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with understanding. "What sort of proposition?" "The kind that would solve your immediate problems but create others you might not have considered." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Marriage of convenience, most likely. His money and protection in exchange for companionship and social standing. It's not unheard of in the territories, and it wouldn't necessarily be dishonorable if both parties understood the terms." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the small clock on Eleanor's dresser. The suggestion hung between them like a bridge across a chasm, visible, potentially useful, but requiring a leap of faith that might end in disaster. "Has he spoken to you directly about this?" Eleanor asked. "Not yet, but Tom says he's been riding past the boarding house most evenings, and he came into the store twice this week, asking casual questions about your situation. A man like Clayton Blackwood doesn't take that kind of interest in someone's welfare without having intentions." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the distant ranch house that glowed like a beacon in the gathering darkness. The building represented security, comfort, and resources that could transform not only her own life, but the educational prospects of every child in Silver Creek. It also represented a form of dependence that went against every principle of independence she had fought to maintain. "What would you do in my situation?" Sarah joined her at the window, both women studying the lights that marked Clayton's domain. "I can't answer that, Eleanor. But I can tell you that Clayton Blackwood is considered an honorable man, even if he's a solitary one. He treated his first wife well, by all accounts, and he's never been known to take advantage of his position in the community. If he makes you an offer, it would likely be genuine and fair, according to his understanding of such things." The conversation continued past the boarding house's official quiet hour, two women weighing impossible choices in the language of practical frontier wisdom. When Sarah finally left, Eleanor remained at the window long into the night, watching the distant lights and wondering whether security might be worth the sacrifice of sovereignty, whether companionship might grow into something deeper given time and patience. The eviction notice lay on her dresser like a countdown to decision day, its legal language marking the boundary between her current independence and whatever future awaited beyond the point of no return. Eleanor spent the following day in a state of careful deliberation, weighing her dwindling options against the specter of complete destitution. The eviction notice allowed her 5 more days to find alternative arrangements, and her inquiries about positions in other towns had yielded only polite rejections or suggestions that she reapply during the spring hiring season. The arithmetic of survival had become brutally simple: accept whatever proposition Clayton Blackwood might offer, or face the prospect of leaving Silver Creek with no destination and insufficient funds for travel. That evening, as she sat in the boarding house parlor, attempting to maintain her usual appearance of composure, Mrs. Coleman approached with news that quickened Eleanor's pulse. "Mr. Blackwood is here to see you." the landlady announced, her tone carefully neutral. "I've shown him into the front parlor." Eleanor's hands moved automatically to smooth her hair and straighten her dress, though she knew that no amount of primping could disguise the worn fabric or careful mending that marked her garments as those of someone living on severely limited means. She made her way to the parlor with measured steps, reminding herself that dignity remained her most valuable possession, regardless of external circumstances. Clayton Blackwood stood with his back to the door, studying a daguerreotype on the mantel that showed Mrs. Coleman's late husband in his Union Army uniform. When he turned at Eleanor's entrance, she was struck by the careful attention he had paid to his appearance, clean-shaven, dressed in a well-tailored black suit that spoke of custom work and expensive fabric, his dark hair recently trimmed and carefully combed. Yet despite the formal presentation, his eyes held an uncertainty that surprised her. "Miss Harper," he said, offering a slight bow that managed to convey respect without condescension. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Mr. Blackwood." Eleanor settled into the chair. Mrs. Coleman had arranged to provide maximum propriety, noting how Clayton remained standing until she was seated. "I understand you wish to speak with me." Clayton's right hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket, where the outline of his father's gold pocket watch was visible against the dark fabric. The gesture struck Eleanor as nervous rather than ostentatious, as if he were drawing comfort from something familiar in an unfamiliar situation. "I've been observing your work with the local children," he began, his voice carefully modulated to carry through the room without seeming loud or aggressive. "Their parents speak highly of your teaching methods, and I've seen marked improvement in several youngsters who previously showed little interest in learning." Eleanor felt a flutter of hope that perhaps Sarah's interpretation had been incorrect, that Clayton's interest might be purely philanthropic. "Thank you. The children are eager to learn when given proper encouragement and materials." "Indeed." Clayton moved to the window, gazing out toward the main street where evening shadows gathered between the buildings. "I've been considering the possibility of funding a proper schoolhouse for Silver Creek, perhaps with living quarters attached for the teacher. The investment would benefit the entire community." "That would be wonderful," Eleanor said, though something in his tone suggested complications ahead. Clayton turned from the window, and Eleanor saw that his expression had grown more serious, almost pained. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. "However, I find myself in the position of requiring something in return for such an investment. Not financial compensation, you understand, but a form of companionship that I've been lacking since my wife's death." Eleanor's breath caught, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I'm not a young man, Miss Harper, nor am I given to romantic illusions. What I'm proposing is a practical arrangement that would benefit both parties while maintaining the respect and propriety that our community expects." Clayton's hand went again to his pocket, and this time Eleanor noticed the thin gold band that circled his ring finger, Martha's wedding ring, which he still wore 3 years after her death. "I'm listening," Eleanor said, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Marriage," Clayton said simply. "A union that would provide you with security, resources, and the means to establish the school you envision. In exchange, I would ask for your companionship, your presence in my home, and the social standing that comes with having a wife." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across a dangerous chasm. Eleanor found herself studying Clayton's face, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motive, but finding only a profound loneliness that matched her own isolation. "You barely know me," she said finally. "True," Clayton acknowledged, "but I know enough. You're educated, principled, and dedicated to work that matters. You've shown courage in coming west alone, and compassion in your treatment of the children. These qualities suggest character that I admire." Eleanor stood and moved to the window where Clayton had been standing, looking out at the street where a few late travelers made their way toward home or entertainment. The view provided her with time to process the magnitude of what was being offered, not just personal security, but the means to accomplish everything she had dreamed of since receiving her teaching certificate. "What would you expect from such an arrangement?" she asked without turning around. "Companionship," Clayton repeated. "Someone to share meals with, to discuss the day's events, to provide the social interaction that makes a house feel like a home." "I would not expect," he paused, searching for delicate language. "I would not presume intimacies beyond what you might choose to offer freely." Eleanor turned to face him, surprised by the careful respect in his voice. "And if such intimacies never developed? Then we would have a partnership based on mutual benefit and respect. I believe such arrangements can be satisfying in their own way, particularly when both parties understand the terms clearly." The conversation continued for another hour, with Clayton outlining the practical details of his proposal, a formal wedding ceremony that would satisfy community expectations, living arrangements at the ranch that would provide Eleanor with her own space and independence, and financial backing for a school that would serve children throughout the valley. Eleanor asked careful questions about expectations, boundaries, and the possibility of dissolving the arrangement if it proved unsatisfactory to either party. When Clayton finally took his leave, he pressed a small velvet box into Eleanor's hand. "My mother's engagement ring," he explained. "If you decide to accept my proposal, it would honor me if you would wear it. If not, please keep it as a token of my admiration for your work with the children." Eleanor waited until she heard his horse's hoofbeats fade into the distance before opening the box. The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, a single pearl surrounded by small diamonds, set in white gold that caught the lamplight and threw it back in gentle sparkles. It was the ring of a woman who had been loved and cherished, not merely accumulated as a symbol of wealth. That night, Eleanor lay awake, weighing the proposal against her remaining alternatives. Marriage to a stranger represented a form of surrender, an acknowledgement that her independence had proven insufficient to sustain her dreams. Yet it also represented opportunity, the chance to build something meaningful from the foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose that Clayton had described. By morning, she had reached her decision. Eleanor's acceptance of Clayton's proposal moved through Silver Creek's social circles with the speed typical of frontier communities, where personal business became public knowledge within hours rather than days. The formal marriage contract that Clayton's lawyer drew up specified terms that protected both parties. Eleanor would retain ownership of her personal belongings and teaching materials, while Clayton would provide housing, living expenses, and funding for educational endeavors. Most importantly, the document outlined provisions for annulment should either party find the arrangement unsatisfactory after a trial period of 1 year. The contract's existence scandalized some of the more traditional residents, who felt that marriage should be based on romantic attachment rather than practical considerations. Others, particularly the women who understood the limited options available to unmarried females in the territories, expressed quiet approval of Eleanor's pragmatic choice. Sarah Mitchell proved especially supportive, helping Eleanor navigate the social complexities that surrounded unconventional unions. The wedding ceremony took place on a Thursday morning in the Silver Creek Community Church, with attendance limited to essential witnesses and community leaders. Eleanor wore her best dresser navy blue wool with careful alterations that disguised its age, while Clayton appeared in formal attire that emphasized his role as the community's most prosperous citizen. Reverend Patterson conducted the service with appropriate gravity, though Eleanor noticed his careful choice of words that emphasized companionship and mutual support rather than passionate devotion. Moving her belongings to the Blackwood Ranch required only a single wagon trip, a fact that highlighted the modest scope of her worldly possessions. The ranch house proved even more impressive, up close, than it had appeared from town. 3 stories of carefully crafted architecture that spoke of both wealth and refined taste. Clayton guided her through the public rooms with obvious pride, pointing out details that revealed his deep investment in creating a beautiful living space. "The library occupies most of the second floor," he explained, opening double doors to reveal a room that took Eleanor's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held hundreds of volumes covering subjects from agriculture and animal husbandry to philosophy and literature. Comfortable reading chairs were positioned near windows that provided excellent natural light, while a massive stone fireplace promised cozy evenings during the harsh winter months. "This is magnificent," Eleanor breathed, moving toward the shelves with the reverence of someone who had always treasured books but had owned precious few. Clayton's face brightened at her obvious pleasure. "Please consider these entirely at your disposal. I've always found that books improve with sharing, and many of these volumes have been lonely for someone who might appreciate their contents." Eleanor's rooms occupied a corner of the second floor that provided both privacy and access to the main living areas. Clayton had obviously given careful thought to her comfort, furnishing the space with feminine touches that suggested he had sought advice from women in the community. Fresh flowers graced the writing desk, and the wardrobe was spacious enough to accommodate a much more extensive collection of garments than Eleanor currently possessed. "I hope these accommodations suit your needs," Clayton said, lingering in the doorway with obvious uncertainty. "If you require changes or additions, please don't hesitate to speak freely." Eleanor tested the firmness of the bed and examined the quality of the furnishings, finding everything far superior to anything she had experienced during her adult life. "This is more than adequate, Mr. Blackwood. Thank you for your thoughtfulness." "Clayton," he corrected gently. "We're married now, after all, even if the circumstances are unusual." The first weeks of their cohabitation passed with careful politeness that gradually evolved into something approaching comfortable routine. Clayton proved to be an early riser who enjoyed beginning each day with coffee and the previous day's newspaper, which arrived by mail from Sacramento with predictable delays. Eleanor discovered that he was a thoughtful conversationalist who asked genuine questions about her teaching plans and listened carefully to her responses. Meals presented the greatest challenge to their developing relationship, as both struggled to navigate the intimacy of shared dining without the foundation of romantic attachment that typically made such moments natural. Eleanor had grown accustomed to eating quickly and efficiently during her time at the boarding house, while Clayton clearly had experience with more formal dining customs that required leisurely conversation and attention to social niceties. "Tell me about your family," Clayton requested during their third dinner together, as Eleanor carefully cut her portion of roasted chicken into precisely equal pieces. "There's little to tell," Eleanor replied, her tone suggesting that the subject carried complications she preferred to avoid. "My parents died when I was 16, and I have no siblings. I supported myself through teaching positions until I decided to come west." Clayton sensed the careful editing in her response, but respected her privacy too much to press for details. "I'm sorry for your loss. Family connections provide stability that's difficult to replace." Eleanor looked up from her plate, studying Clayton's face with new attention. "What about your family? You've mentioned your father's business interests, but little else." Clayton's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how much personal history to share with this woman, who was legally his wife, but remained emotionally a stranger. "My father built the mining operation that became the foundation of our wealth. He was a practical man who believed in hard work and careful planning. My mother provided the cultural refinement that he lacked. She insisted on books, music, and education, despite the frontier setting." "And Martha?" Eleanor asked gently. Clayton's hand moved unconsciously to his wedding ring, a gesture that Eleanor had observed whenever the conversation touched on emotional subjects. "Martha was my childhood friend, who became my wife. She died giving birth to our son, who lived only 3 days. They're buried together in the family cemetery on the ridge behind the house." The conversation grew quiet as both contemplated the weight of loss that had shaped their current circumstances. Eleanor understood now why Clayton maintained careful emotional distance, not from coldness, but from the self-protection that comes after devastating grief. After dinner, they established a routine of spending an hour in the library before retiring to their separate rooms. Clayton, would read aloud from various books, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. Eleanor proved to be an engaged listener who asked thoughtful questions and offered occasional insights that revealed the depth of her education. These evening sessions gradually became the cornerstone of their developing relationship. Literature provided neutral ground where they could explore ideas and emotions without the pressure of personal revelation. Through discussions of fictional characters and literary themes, they began to understand each other's values, fears, and aspirations in ways that direct questioning might never have achieved. One evening, as Clayton finished reading a particularly moving passage from a novel about frontier life, Eleanor surprised him with a question that revealed her growing comfort with their arrangement. "Do you ever regret your proposal?" she asked. "Has this experiment proven worthwhile, or have you simply acquired an expensive housekeeper with intellectual pretensions?" Clayton closed the book carefully, using the time to formulate a response that would be both honest and encouraging. "I regret nothing," he said finally. "You've brought life to this house in ways I hadn't anticipated. The sound of your voice, the sight of your books mingled with mine on the shelves. Even the small changes you've made to the household routine of these things remind me that isolation isn't the only way to honor Martha's memory." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at his words, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Perhaps respect and companionship might indeed prove sufficient foundation for the partnership they were building. Perhaps, given time, something deeper might grow from such carefully tended beginnings. 2 months into their marriage, Eleanor discovered that Clayton possessed depths of character that his reputation as a successful but solitary businessman had not revealed. The transformation began when she found him one morning in the library, carefully pressing wildflowers between the pages of his father's leather-bound Bible. The sight stopped her in the doorway, struck by the tenderness with which he handled both the delicate blooms and the sacred text. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, beginning to withdraw. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Please," Clayton said, looking up with an expression that held none of his usual careful reserve. "I'd welcome your opinion on whether these specimens are properly positioned to dry without damaging the pages." Eleanor approached slowly, curious about this unexpected side of her husband's character. The Bible lay open to Ecclesiastes, and she could see that Clayton had been adding to a collection that already included several varieties of desert flowers, each carefully labeled with dates and locations in his precise handwriting. "Martha started this collection," Clayton explained, his voice carrying a gentleness that Eleanor rarely heard during their formal dinner conversations. "She believed that pressing flowers in Scripture would help preserve both the beauty of God's creation and the wisdom of His Word. After she died, I continued the practice. It seemed a way of honoring her memory while maintaining the connection she felt between faith and nature." Eleanor studied the delicate purple blooms that Clayton was positioning near a passage about seasons and timing. "Desert lupine," she identified. "They're particularly beautiful this year." Martha had excellent taste in both flowers and scripture passages. Clayton's face brightened at her recognition of the plant species. "You know wildflowers? My mother taught me botanical identification when I was young. She believed that understanding the natural world was essential to appreciating its creator's artistry." Eleanor touched one of the older specimens, noting the care with which it had been preserved. "These are magnificent examples. Martha obviously possessed both knowledge and patience." The discovery of this shared interest opened new avenues of conversation between them. Clayton began inviting Eleanor to join him on morning rides around the ranch property, ostensibly to check on cattle and equipment, but increasingly focused on identifying and collecting botanical specimens. Eleanor proved to be an accomplished horsewoman, surprising Clayton with her ability to manage even spirited mounts with confidence and grace. During these excursions, Eleanor learned that Clayton's knowledge of his land extended far beyond its commercial value. He could identify bird species by their calls, predict weather patterns from cloud formations, and locate natural springs that had sustained his family's livestock for 3 generations. His relationship with the land was intimate and reverential, that of a steward rather than merely an owner. My father taught me that wealth means nothing if you don't understand what sustains it, Clayton explained one morning as they paused beside a creek that wound through a grove of cottonwood trees. This water comes from snowmelt in the mountains 40 miles north. The grass here grows differently because of mineral deposits left by ancient floods. Understanding these connections makes the difference between success and failure in ranching. Eleanor found herself genuinely fascinated by these lessons in practical ecology. Her academic education had included natural sciences, but Clayton's knowledge was rooted in daily observation and generational wisdom that textbooks couldn't provide. She began bringing a notebook on their rides, recording both botanical observations and Clayton's insights about land management and animal behavior. The transformation in their relationship became apparent to the ranch hands who worked Clayton's property. Miguel Santos, the foreman who had managed the Blackwood cattle operation for 15 years, commented to his wife that the patron seemed more relaxed, more inclined to conversation, and even occasional laughter during their discussions of ranch business. "The Senora brings him peace," Miguel told Maria as they prepared their evening meal in the small house that Clayton provided for his married employees. He speaks of her teaching plans with pride, and he smiles when her name comes up in conversation. This change was most evident during the dinner conversations that had initially felt so awkward. Clayton began asking Eleanor about her progress in establishing the school, offering practical suggestions for dealing with reluctant parents and limited resources. When Eleanor mentioned her frustration with one particular family's resistance to formal education, Clayton surprised her with both understanding and strategy. "The Hendersons value practical skills above book learning," he said thoughtfully, "but their youngest boy, Tommy, has real aptitude for mathematics. If you could demonstrate how arithmetic might help them calculate feed costs or plan crop rotations, they might see education as useful rather than ornamental." Eleanor stared at him across the dinner table, struck by the insight. "How did you know about Tommy's mathematical abilities?" Clayton's cheeks colored slightly. "I may have observed some of your teaching sessions from a distance. I hope you don't consider that intrusive." "You've been watching the children's lessons?" Eleanor felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite identify, pleasure, perhaps, that he took such interest in her work. "Only occasionally, when ranch business brought me near the schoolroom you've established in the old storage building. The children seem genuinely engaged, and their progress is remarkable." Eleanor realized that Clayton had been following her educational efforts far more closely than she had suspected. The storage building he mentioned was one that he had quietly renovated and furnished after their marriage, installing proper windows and heating without consulting her directly. She had assumed the improvements were simply part of his general commitment to supporting education, but now she wondered if his investment was more personal. "What do you think of my teaching methods?" she asked. Clayton considered the question seriously before answering. "I think you understand that learning must be connected to life experience to be meaningful. You don't simply recite facts. You help children discover how knowledge can solve problems they actually face. That's the mark of exceptional teaching." The praise meant more to Eleanor than she had expected. Clayton's opinion carried weight because it was clearly based on careful observation and genuine understanding of educational philosophy. She found herself sharing details about her lesson plans and discussing challenges she faced with individual students, while Clayton offered suggestions that revealed both practical wisdom and deep respect for her professional expertise. Their evening reading sessions evolved as well. Instead of Clayton reading aloud while Eleanor listened, they began taking turns with different books, sometimes reading poetry or passages that moved them, other times engaging in spirited discussions about novels or philosophical works. Eleanor discovered that Clayton had strong opinions about literature and wasn't afraid to disagree with established critical interpretations. "I don't accept that Hawthorne intended Hester Prynne to represent fallen womanhood," Clayton argued one evening after Eleanor had read from the Scarlet Letter. She's clearly the strongest and most moral character in the story. The other characters' judgments reveal their own weaknesses, not hers. Eleanor looked up from the book, surprised by the passion in his voice. That's a remarkably modern interpretation. Is it? Clayton met her gaze directly. I think it's simply honest. Condemning someone for seeking love in the wrong circumstances seems less important than admiring their courage in facing the consequences with dignity. The conversation that followed revealed layers of Clayton's character that his reputation as a practical businessman had concealed. He possessed genuine intellectual curiosity, firm moral convictions, and a capacity for emotional depth that his careful reserve had previously hidden. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these discussions with anticipation that surprised her. One evening, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Clayton hesitated at the foot of the staircase. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying an uncertainty she hadn't heard since their wedding day, "I want you to know that this arrangement has exceeded my expectations in every way. Your presence here has brought me more contentment than I dared hope for when I made my proposal." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I'm glad, Clayton. I found more satisfaction in this partnership than I expected as well." They stood for a moment in the lamplit hallway, each aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The careful politeness of their early weeks together was giving way to genuine affection and mutual respect. Neither was ready to name what was growing between them, but both recognized that their practical arrangement was becoming something deeper and more meaningful than either had anticipated. 3 months into their marriage, Eleanor shared the story of her mother's locket during an evening when spring rain drummed against the library windows and the fire crackled with unusual intensity. The small silver locket had been her constant companion since her mother's death, containing a miniature photograph of her parents taken during their courtship. She had never shown it to Clayton before, but something about the intimate atmosphere of their reading session prompted her to reveal this last, tangible connection to her family. "They look so young and hopeful," Clayton observed, studying the tiny faces with careful attention. "Your mother has your eyes, and the determined set of your chin clearly comes from your father." Eleanor smiled at his observation. "Mother used to say that Papa fell in love with her stubbornness before he noticed her beauty. She claimed it was the only reason their marriage survived 23 years of frontier life." "Tell me about them," Clayton requested, settling back in his chair with the expression of someone prepared to listen for as long as she needed to speak. Eleanor found herself sharing memories she had guarded carefully since coming west, stories of her father's work as a circuit preacher who traveled throughout rural Pennsylvania, bringing both spiritual guidance and basic education to isolated communities. Her mother had accompanied him whenever possible, teaching children to read while he ministered to their parents' spiritual needs. They believed education and faith were inseparable, Eleanor explained. "Papa said that learning to read God's Word was the foundation of both spiritual and practical wisdom, while Mama insisted that ignorance was the enemy of every good thing in life." Clayton listened without interruption, occasionally asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in understanding the influences that had shaped Eleanor's character. When she described the cholera outbreak that had claimed both parents within a week of each other, leaving her alone at 16 with nothing but her determination to honor their values, Clayton's expression grew pained with sympathy. "How did you survive?" he asked gently. "The same way most orphans do, discovering strength I didn't know I possessed, and accepting help from unexpected sources." Eleanor's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to speak of tragedy without self-pity. "The congregation raised money for my teacher training, and I worked as a seamstress and tutor to support myself through normal school." "And your decision to come west, was that always part of your plan?" Eleanor hesitated, recognizing that her answer would require sharing details she had successfully avoided since arriving in Silver Creek. The silver locket seemed to grow warm against her chest, as if her mother's memory was encouraging honesty. "I was engaged to be married," she said finally, "to a man who seemed respectable and financially stable." I thought it was the practical choice security in exchange for companionship, much like our own arrangement. Clayton's attention sharpened, though his expression remained carefully neutral. What changed your mind? I discovered that his understanding of marriage was quite different from mine. He expected a wife who would defer to his judgment in all matters, including how I spent my time and what friendships I maintained. When I expressed interest in continuing my teaching after our wedding, he made it clear that such work would be incompatible with my duties as his wife. Eleanor paused, gathering courage for the most difficult part of her story. When I suggested that we postpone the wedding until we could reach better understanding about our expectations, he became angry. Not just disappointed, truly angry, in ways that frightened me. He accused me of having ideas above my station and said he would teach me proper behavior after we were married. Clayton's hands clenched into fists, though his voice remained calm. He threatened you? Not directly, but the implications were clear enough. I realized that marrying him would mean surrendering everything I valued about myself, my independence, my work, my right to express opinions that differed from his. So I broke the engagement and used my savings to travel west, hoping to find communities that needed teachers more than they needed wives who fit conventional expectations. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows as Clayton processed what Eleanor had shared. Her story explained the careful way she had negotiated their own marriage contract, the importance she placed on maintaining her teaching work, and the subtle watchfulness he had noticed whenever their conversations touched on authority or decision-making. "I'm grateful you chose to tell me," Clayton said eventually. "It helps me understand why trust comes carefully for you, and why independence means more than comfort." Eleanor studied his face, searching for signs of judgment or calculation, but finding only compassion and respect. "Are you concerned that I might prove similarly difficult as a wife?" Clayton's laugh held genuine warmth. "Eleanor, I propose to you precisely because you demonstrated strength and independence. A woman who would accept my offer only from desperation, or who would surrender her principles for security, would make a poor partner for anyone. I want a wife who challenges me to be better, not one who simply agrees with everything I say." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Eleanor felt a fundamental change in their relationship. By sharing her most vulnerable memories, she had tested whether Clayton would prove worthy of deeper trust. His response had demonstrated the kind of character that made emotional intimacy possible rather than dangerous. Over the following weeks, Eleanor noticed that Clayton began seeking her opinions on matters beyond household management and education. He asked for her thoughts about ranch improvements, community politics, and even business decisions that traditionally fell within male authority. When Eleanor pointed out that such consultation was unusual for married couples in their community, Clayton's response surprised her. "Unusual doesn't mean wrong," he said. "You have excellent judgment and a different perspective than mine. Why would I ignore such valuable counsel simply because convention suggests I should make decisions alone?" Eleanor found herself falling into comfortable patterns of shared responsibility that felt natural rather than negotiated. She began handling correspondence with suppliers and customers who appreciated her careful attention to detail and diplomatic communication style. Clayton delegated increasing authority to her in matters involving community relations, recognizing that her position as the schoolteacher gave her insights into family dynamics and local concerns that his wealth sometimes obscured. Their physical proximity also evolved during this period, though both remained careful to respect the boundaries they had established. Eleanor began joining Clayton for morning coffee on the front porch, where they would discuss the day's plans while watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and rose. These quiet moments of shared contemplation created intimacy without pressure, allowing both to appreciate each other's company without the weight of unfulfilled expectations. One morning, as they sat watching a hawk circle over the pasture where Clayton's cattle grazed, Eleanor surprised herself by reaching over to touch his hand briefly. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For proving that partnership and respect can exist between a man and woman, even when romance isn't the foundation." You've shown me that marriage doesn't have to mean surrender." Clayton turned his hand palm up, allowing her fingers to rest against his for a moment, longer than strictly necessary. "You've taught me that loneliness isn't the price of honoring the past. We've both gained more than we expected from this arrangement." Neither spoke of love, but both recognized that something precious was growing between them, a connection based on mutual admiration, shared values, and the daily choice to treat each other with kindness and respect. Whether such feelings might eventually deepen into romantic love remained uncertain, but the foundation they were building felt strong enough to support whatever future might develop from their careful beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, delivered by a special courier who had ridden hard from the railroad station in Reno. Eleanor was in the schoolroom working with 6 children on their arithmetic lessons when Mrs. Santos knocked urgently on the door, her face pale with concern. "Senora Blackwood, a man has come with a letter for you. He says it is very urgent and he must wait for your response." Eleanor's heart lurched with immediate dread. In her experience, urgent letters rarely carried good news, and the formal address on the envelope, Miss Eleanor Harper, care of Silver Creek, Nevada Territory, suggested that the sender either didn't know about her marriage or chose not to acknowledge it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, written in the careful script of someone accustomed to legal documents. She dismissed the children early, promising to continue their lesson the following day, then walked slowly toward the ranch house where the courier waited in the front parlor. Clayton was reviewing account books in his study, but he emerged when he heard voices, his expression growing concerned as he noted Eleanor's obvious distress. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. Eleanor held up the unopened letter with hands that trembled slightly. "I don't know yet, but I fear it concerns my past in ways that might affect our future." Clayton gestured toward the library, offering privacy for whatever news the letter might contain. Eleanor settled into her favorite reading chair, while Clayton took a position near the window, close enough to provide support, but far enough away to respect her privacy if she needed to process difficult information alone. The letter was from a Pinkerton detective named William Morrison, hired by someone identified only as "my client," to locate Eleanor Harper, formerly of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The language was professional and carefully neutral, but Eleanor could feel menace behind the formal phrases. "Miss Harper," the letter began, "my client has retained my services to locate your current whereabouts and assess your circumstances. He has reason to believe you departed Philadelphia without properly concluding certain personal obligations, and he wishes to discuss these matters with you directly. I have traced your movements to the Nevada Territory and will arrive in Silver Creek within the week to speak with you personally. I trust you will make yourself available for this conversation, as my client is most eager to renew your acquaintance." Eleanor's face went white as she read, and Clayton moved immediately to her side. "What is it?" he asked. His voice, carrying the controlled calm that Eleanor had learned, indicated serious concern. "My former fiancé has hired a detective to find me," Eleanor whispered. "He's coming here." Clayton's expression darkened as Eleanor explained the letter's contents and what she knew about Reginald Ashworth's character and determination. When she had broken their engagement, he had threatened legal action, claiming she had damaged his reputation and business prospects by rejecting him publicly. The threats had seemed empty, at the time desperate attempts to manipulate her into reconsidering, but apparently his anger had festered during the months since her departure. "What kind of man hires detectives to pursue a woman who has clearly chosen to end their relationship?" Clayton asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The kind who believes women are property to be claimed rather than people with the right to make their own choices," Eleanor replied bitterly. "Reginald convinced himself that I would eventually see reason and return to him. My continued absence has apparently challenged that assumption." Clayton read the letter carefully, his business experience helping him decode the implications behind the detective's careful language. "This Morrison fellow is being deliberately vague about the personal obligations your former fiancé claims you left unfulfilled. That suggests he's hoping to intimidate you into compliance rather than pursuing legitimate legal claims." "What should I do?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "We should prepare for his arrival and make clear that you are no longer available for whatever reunion he has in mind," Clayton said firmly. "You're my wife now, under the protection of both law and community standing. Even if he arrives with legal documents, he can't simply take you away against your will." Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude for Clayton's immediate support, but also growing fear about the complications that Reginald's arrival might bring to their carefully constructed life. "You don't understand how persistent he can be, or how convincing. He's wealthy, well-connected, and accustomed to getting what he wants through legal manipulation and social pressure. Then he's about to learn that such tactics have limited effectiveness in the territories." Clayton replied with grim satisfaction. "Out here, a man's character matters more than his connections, and women have more legal protections than they might enjoy in eastern cities." Over the following days, Clayton proved his commitment to Eleanor's protection through both practical preparation and emotional support. He consulted with the territorial judge about Eleanor's legal status as a married woman, confirming that her husband's consent would be required for any legal proceedings that might affect her person or property. He also spoke privately with Sheriff Martinez about the situation, ensuring that local law enforcement understood the circumstances surrounding the detective's impending visit. Eleanor found herself touched by the extent of Clayton's protective measures, but also troubled by the potential consequences for their marriage. Their relationship had been built on mutual respect and careful negotiation of boundaries, not on her need for masculine protection from external threats. She worried that Reginald's arrival might transform Clayton from partner to protector, fundamentally altering the dynamic they had worked so hard to establish. "I don't want you to fight my battles for me," she told him one evening as they discussed strategy for handling the detective's visit. "I'm not fighting your battles," Clayton replied. "I'm standing with you as you fight them yourself. There's a difference." Eleanor studied his face, searching for signs that he was merely saying what he thought she wanted to hear. Instead, she found the same steady resolve that had characterized his approach to every challenge they had faced together. "What if he has legal grounds to force my return? What if my marriage to you isn't sufficient to protect me from whatever claims he might make?" Clayton took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Then we'll face those challenges together, as partners should. But Eleanor, you need to understand, what started as a practical arrangement has become much more important to me than mere convenience. I will not allow anyone to take you away or harm you, not because I own you, but because I care deeply about your well-being and happiness." The words hung between them like a bridge across the careful distance they had maintained. Neither was ready to speak of love, but both recognized that their feelings had evolved far beyond the terms of their original agreement. Whatever challenges Reginald's arrival might bring, they would face them as a team, united by something much stronger than legal contracts or financial arrangements. The detective arrived 3 days later, accompanied by a well-dressed man whose expensive clothes and imperious manner immediately identified him as someone accustomed to wealth and privilege. Eleanor watched from the upstairs window as they rode up the ranch's main drive, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger that surprised her with its intensity. Reginald Ashworth looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a conventional way, with the kind of polished appearance that impressed people who valued surface respectability over genuine character. But even from a distance, Eleanor could see the cold determination in his posture that had always made her uncomfortable during their courtship. Clayton met them at the front door, with the formal courtesy that frontier hospitality demanded, but Eleanor could see the steel in his spine as he guided them into the parlor for what would prove to be the most important confrontation of their marriage. Eleanor descended the stairs with measured steps, her hand trailing along the polished banister that Clayton's careful maintenance kept smooth and gleaming. She had chosen her clothing deliberately, the navy blue dress that she had worn for their wedding, altered now to fit better and accessorized with the pearl engagement ring that Clayton's mother had worn decades earlier. Every detail of her appearance announced her status as a married woman of respectability and means. Clayton stood as she entered the parlor, his gesture of respect both genuine and strategic. The two visitors remained seated, a breach of courtesy that spoke volumes about their attitude toward both Eleanor and the social conventions that governed frontier society. Reginald Ashworth looked exactly as Eleanor remembered, well-groomed, with the kind of confident bearing that impressed people who mistook arrogance for strength. "Eleanor," Reginald said, rising belatedly and offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look well. Frontier life appears to agree with you." "Mr. Ashworth," Eleanor replied, her voice carefully neutral, "this is unexpected." "I should hope so," Reginald said with forced joviality. "I've traveled considerable distance to discuss the misunderstanding that led to your sudden departure from Philadelphia. I'm confident we can resolve these matters quickly and return to our original plans." Eleanor felt Clayton's presence beside her like an anchor in stormy weather. His Colt .45 revolver, his father's gun, rested in its holster at his hip, a reminder that frontier justice operated under different rules than the legal maneuvering that Reginald preferred. The weapon had been his father's during the war, carried through battles that had tested men's courage and character in ways that drawing-room politics never could. "I'm afraid there's been no misunderstanding," Eleanor said firmly. "I made my position clear when I ended our engagement. I have since married Mr. Blackwood, and I'm quite content with my current circumstances." The detective, Morrison, spoke for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. "Mrs. Blackwood, my client has reason to believe that your marriage may not be entirely voluntary. If you're being coerced or threatened, I'm authorized to provide protection and safe passage back to Philadelphia." Clayton's laugh held no humor. "Coerced? By offering her security, respect, and the means to pursue her teaching career? That's an interesting definition of coercion, Mr. Morrison." Reginald's mask of civility began to slip. "Come now, Eleanor. Surely you can't prefer this rustic existence to the life I offered you in Philadelphia. I'm prepared to overlook your temporary lapse in judgment and honor our original understanding." "Our original understanding," Eleanor repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word, "involved my surrender of everything I valued about myself in exchange for your financial support. Mr. Blackwood has offered me partnership rather than possession. I know which I prefer." The conversation continued for another hour, with Reginald alternately pleading and threatening, while Morrison took careful notes that Eleanor suspected would be used to support whatever legal action they might pursue. Clayton remained mostly silent, allowing Eleanor to speak for herself, while making his support unmistakably clear through his presence and occasional pointed questions about the visitor's legal authority in territorial matters. When the formal discussion concluded without the resolution that Reginald had obviously expected, he requested private accommodations in town to consider his options. Sheriff Martinez, who had arrived during the conversation at Clayton's invitation, offered to escort them to the boarding house and ensure they understood local customs regarding the treatment of married women. After the visitors departed, Eleanor and Clayton sat in the library, trying to process what had occurred and prepare for whatever might come next. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows across the walls, lined with books that had become symbols of their shared intellectual life. "He won't give up easily," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had hoped never to deal with such complications again. "Reginald sees my rejection as a challenge to be overcome rather than a decision to be respected." Clayton studied the flames, his expression thoughtful. What legal claims might he actually have? "You mentioned that he threatened legal action when you ended the engagement." Eleanor explained the basis of Reginald's possible claims breach of promise suits that some states allowed when engagements were broken. Financial obligations related to wedding preparations that had been undertaken before she left, and social contracts that he claimed gave him rights to her person and property. Most of these claims would be difficult to pursue in territorial courts, but Reginald had connections that might allow him to pressure federal authorities or eastern courts with jurisdiction over contracts made in Philadelphia. "The real danger isn't legal proceedings," Eleanor said. It's that he'll find ways to make our life here so difficult that I'll eventually agree to return with him just to protect you and the community from his harassment." Clayton's expression hardened with determination. "Eleanor, I want you to understand something clearly. I didn't propose marriage to you as a charitable gesture or temporary convenience. What we've built together matters to me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I won't allow anyone to destroy what we've created, regardless of the cost or effort required to protect it." Eleanor felt her heart skip at the intensity in his voice. "Clayton, I can't ask you to sacrifice your standing in the community or risk legal troubles for my sake. If Reginald can make a compelling case for his claims, perhaps I should." "No." Clayton's interruption was gentle but absolute. "We made vows to each other, Eleanor, even if they weren't motivated by romantic love. Those vows meant something to me then, and they mean even more now. You're my wife, my partner, and my friend. I will not abandon you to spare myself inconvenience." Over the following days, Clayton's commitment to Eleanor's protection manifested in both practical preparations and emotional support that revealed the depth of his feelings. He consulted with lawyers in Carson City about territorial law and federal jurisdiction, arranged for character witnesses who could testify to Eleanor's contentment and voluntary participation in their marriage, and quietly asked for support from community leaders who respected both his judgment and Eleanor's contributions to local education. Miguel Santos proved particularly valuable in these preparations, as his network of contacts throughout the territory provided information about Reginald's activities and intentions. The detective had been asking questions in town about Clayton's business practices and Eleanor's behavior, apparently hoping to find evidence of impropriety that might support claims of coercion or fraud. "They're looking for scandal," Miguel reported during one of his evening conversations with Clayton. "The Eastern man, he asks about your first wife, about how quickly you married after she died, about whether Senora Eleanor seems happy or frightened. He talks to people who don't know you well, hoping for gossip." Clayton's anger at this invasion of his family's memory was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. What have people told him? "Nothing useful for his purposes," Miguel assured him. "Everyone speaks of your respect for Martha's memory and your kindness to Senora Eleanor. The children's parents especially praise her teaching and say she seems content and well treated." Eleanor found herself deeply moved by the community's support, which extended far beyond what their practical arrangement might have warranted. Sarah Mitchell organized the women of Silver Creek to provide character testimony, while Tom Rodriguez and the other business owners prepared to speak about Eleanor's positive influence on local children and families. Even Mrs. Coleman, despite her initial reservations about Eleanor's unconventional circumstances, offered to testify about her respectable behavior and voluntary choices. The most significant support came from an unexpected source territorial judge, Harrison Blackstone, who had known Clayton's father during the early days of Nevada's mining boom. Judge Blackstone sent word that he would be available to review any legal proceedings that Reginald might initiate, and that territorial courts looked unfavorably on attempts by Eastern interests to override local marriage contracts and community standards. As the week progressed, Eleanor and Clayton found their relationship deepening under the pressure of external threat. The careful boundaries they had maintained began to feel artificial in the face of challenges that required complete trust and mutual support. Eleanor began joining Clayton for his morning rides around the ranch property, not just for botanical collecting, but for the private conversations that helped them coordinate their strategy and provide emotional reassurance. One evening, as they prepared their final plans for whatever confrontation might come, Clayton surprised Eleanor with a direct question that neither had dared ask before. "Eleanor, regardless of what happens with Ashworth's claims, I need to know something. Are you happy with the life we've built together? Not just content or satisfied, but genuinely happy?" Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "Yes, Clayton. More happy than I thought possible when I accepted your proposal. Our partnership has given me everything I hoped for and things I didn't dare dream of." Then we'll fight for it, Clayton said simply. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk. Some things are worth defending with everything a man has. The final confrontation was set for the following morning, when Reginald and his detective would present their formal demands and Eleanor would give her definitive response. Both Eleanor and Clayton knew that their answer would determine not only the immediate crisis, but the future of their marriage and their place in the Silver Creek community. The morning of the final confrontation dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the landscape in shades of gold and rose, while the Silver Creek school bell waited silent in the building where she had invested so much hope and effort. The bell represented everything she had built in this community, the trust of parents, the progress of children, and the sense of purpose that had been missing from her life before coming west. She dressed with particular care, choosing the dress that Clayton had bought for her during a recent trip to Carson City deep green wool, with careful tailoring that spoke of quality and respectability. The pearl engagement ring caught the morning light, reminding her of the woman who had worn it before her and the love that Clayton had been capable of giving and receiving. Downstairs, Clayton waited in the dining room with coffee and breakfast laid out with their usual precision, though neither of them showed much appetite for food. He wore his best suit charcoal grey, with a vest that held his father's gold pocket watch, the same timepiece that had marked the lonely hours before Eleanor's arrival in his life. His Colt .45 rode in its holster, a reminder that frontier justice operated under different principles than the legal maneuvering that Reginald preferred. "Are you ready for this?" Clayton asked, studying Eleanor's face for signs of doubt or fear. "As ready as anyone can be for defending their right to choose their own life," Eleanor replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Thank you for standing with me, Clayton. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my adult life." Clayton's expression grew serious. "Eleanor, before they arrive, there's something I need to say. Our marriage began as a practical arrangement, but it's become much more than that for me. He paused, struggling with words that carried more weight than any he had spoken since Martha's death. "I've come to love you, not just as a partner or companion, but as the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. Whatever claims Ashworth might make, I want you to know that my commitment to you isn't based on duty or honor alone." Eleanor felt her heart skip at his words, recognizing the courage required for such a declaration when the outcome of their crisis remained uncertain. "Clayton, I love you too. I fought against the feeling for weeks, telling myself it was gratitude or security or simple loneliness, but it's much more than that. You've shown me what partnership can be when both people choose to respect and cherish each other." They might have said more, but the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of their visitors. Clayton squeezed Eleanor's hand briefly before moving to the window to observe Reginald, and Detective Morrison consulted his notes before responding. "Your Honor, my client believes that Miss Harper, Mrs. Blackwood, was in desperate financial circumstances when this marriage occurred. Such desperation might constitute duress, particularly if she was pressured into the arrangement by threats of destitution." Eleanor rose from her chair, her voice carrying the authority she had developed through months of teaching and community leadership. "Mr. Morrison, I was indeed facing financial difficulties when I accepted Clayton's proposal. However, I was free to seek other solutions employment elsewhere, assistance from charitable organizations, or return to Philadelphia to face whatever consequences my broken engagement might have brought. I chose to marry Clayton because I respected his character and believed we could build a meaningful partnership together." "Respect and partnership," Reginald scoffed. "Eleanor, you're an educated woman with refined sensibilities. How can you prefer this rustic existence to the cultured life I offered you in Philadelphia? I'm prepared to establish you in a proper household with servants and social position that matches your breeding. Because this rustic existence includes something your offer never provided," Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. The right to be treated as an equal partner rather than an ornamental possession. Clayton consults me about decisions that affect our life together. He supports my teaching work rather than seeing it as competition for his authority. He treats me as someone whose opinions and feelings matter, not as someone whose primary value lies in silent compliance with his wishes. The school bell outside began to chime the hour 9 o'clock, when Eleanor's students would normally gather for their morning lessons. The sound seemed to underscore everything she had built in Silver Creek, the trust and respect she had earned through her own efforts, rather than inherited through marriage to a wealthy man. "Mr. Ashworth," Judge Blackstone interjected, "what specific legal claims do you wish to pursue?" Mrs. Blackwood appears to be speaking freely and voluntarily about her circumstances. Reginald produced a leather portfolio containing legal documents. "Breach of promise, Your Honor. Eleanor agreed to marry me, accepted gifts and financial support during our courtship, and allowed me to make substantial expenditures for wedding preparations. Her sudden departure caused significant financial loss and damage to my social standing in Philadelphia. I returned your engagement ring and every gift you had given me," Eleanor countered. "I paid for my own travel west using money I had earned through my own work. I never accepted financial support from you beyond the social courtesies normal during courtship." Clayton spoke for the first time since the formal proceedings began. "Mr. Ashworth, even if territorial courts had jurisdiction over contracts made in Pennsylvania, which is questionable, you would need to prove that Mrs. Blackwood's departure was motivated by malice or fraud, rather than legitimate concern about your compatibility as marriage partners. Can you demonstrate such malice?" Reginald's carefully controlled demeanor finally cracked completely. "Compatibility? She's a schoolteacher with no family connections and limited prospects. I offered her social position, financial security, and respectability. Her rejection of such advantages can only be explained by mental instability or outside influence." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot. Eleanor felt Clayton tense beside her, recognizing that Reginald had finally revealed his true character to everyone present. Sheriff Martinez shifted in his chair, his hand moving closer to his own weapon as the atmosphere in the room grew dangerous. "Mr. Ashworth," Eleanor said, her voice carrying ice-cold precision, "you've just demonstrated exactly why I was right to end our engagement. You see my worth only in terms of what social advancement I might provide you, and my independent judgment as evidence of mental deficiency. Clayton sees me as a partner whose thoughts and feelings matter as much as his own. I know which man deserves my loyalty." The confrontation had reached its turning point, with all parties understanding that the next few moments would determine the outcome of the entire crisis. Morrison riding up the main drive. Behind them came Sheriff Martinez and Judge Blackstone, whose presence would ensure that any legal proceedings followed territorial law rather than Eastern assumptions about women's rights and marital obligations. The confrontation took place in the front parlor, with all parties seated in careful arrangement that spoke of formal legal proceedings rather than social visits. Reginald wore his finest traveling clothes and maintained the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through wealth and social connections. Detective Morrison appeared more cautious, perhaps recognizing that territorial law might not support the aggressive tactics that worked in eastern cities. "Eleanor," Reginald began without preamble, "I've come to take you home. This charade has gone on long enough, and I'm prepared to overlook your temporary lapse in judgment if you'll return with me immediately." "This is my home," Eleanor replied calmly. "I'm married to Clayton Blackwood under territorial law, and I have no intention of leaving either my husband or my community." Reginald's mask of civility began to crack. "Your so-called marriage is obviously fraudulent, a desperate arrangement between a lonely old man and a woman with limited options. No court would recognize such a union as valid if the circumstances were properly explained." Judge Blackstone spoke for the first time since introductions. "Mr. Ashworth, I've reviewed the marriage certificate and interviewed witnesses to the ceremony. Miss Blackwood's union is entirely legal and valid under territorial statutes. Do you have evidence of coercion or fraud that would warrant legal intervention?" Reginald's face flushed red with anger and humiliation as he realized that his carefully planned campaign had not only failed, but exposed his character to official witnesses. Detective Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable, recognizing that his client's behavior was undermining any legitimate legal claims they might have pursued. "This is ridiculous," Reginald snarled, abandoning all pretense of civilized discourse. "Eleanor, you belong to me. We had an understanding, and I won't allow some frontier nobody to steal what's rightfully mine." Clayton stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled in the way that suggested considerable physical danger, held carefully in check. "Mr. Ashworth, you just made a serious error. Mrs. Blackwood doesn't belong to Anya, not to you, not to me, not to any man. She's a free citizen with the right to choose her own husband and her own life." "Free citizen?" Reginald laughed harshly. "She's a woman with no family, no property, and no means of supporting herself. Whatever pretty words you use to describe this arrangement, she's essentially your purchased companion. At least I had the honesty to offer her legitimate marriage rather than this frontier farce." Eleanor moved to her teaching slate, which she had brought down from the schoolroom that morning as evidence of her work in the community. With careful deliberation, she wrote her response in letters large enough for everyone in the room to read. "I choose Clayton Blackwood as my husband, freely and without coercion." "There," she said, setting down the chalk and facing Reginald directly. "My final answer, written in my own hand for all to witness. I am not your property, Mr. Ashworth. I never was, despite your assumptions. I am Clayton's wife by choice, and I will remain so as long as he'll have me." Reginald lunged forward as if to grab Eleanor's arm, but Clayton stepped between them with fluid motion that spoke of considerable physical training. Sheriff Martinez also moved, his hand now resting openly on his weapon. "Mr. Ashworth," the sheriff said calmly, "I strongly suggest you step back and remember where you are. Territorial law takes a dim view of men who attempt to manhandle women, regardless of any claims they might believe they have." Detective Morrison finally spoke up, his professional instincts overriding his client's emotions. "Reginald, this isn't going as we planned. Perhaps we should reconsider our options and pursue this matter through proper legal channels." "Proper legal channels?" Judge Blackstone interjected with dry humor. "Mr. Morrison, this is the proper legal channel. I'm the territorial judge with jurisdiction over marriage disputes in this county. Mrs. Blackwood has stated her position clearly and voluntarily, with witnesses present to confirm her competence and freedom of choice. Unless you have evidence of fraud, coercion, or mental incapacity, there are no grounds for legal intervention." Reginald's composure finally shattered completely. "Mental incapacity? Look at her choices. She's abandoned a comfortable life in civilization to live in this God-forsaken wilderness, teaching dirty children for a man who could afford to buy and sell every person in this pathetic town. If that's not evidence of mental instability, I don't know what is." The insult to her students and community proved to be the final straw for Eleanor. She stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority she had developed through months of commanding classroom attention and respect. "Mr. Ashworth, you've revealed everything anyone needs to know about your character. You see children as dirty rather than precious. You see this community as pathetic rather than hard-working and honest. And you see my teaching as worthless rather than meaningful work that improves lives. Clayton values what I value: education, community, and the belief that every person deserves respect, regardless of their social position or financial circumstances." Sheriff Martinez stood, his patience clearly exhausted. "Mr. Ashworth, Detective Morrison, I'm going to escort you back to town now. Your business here is concluded, and Mrs. Blackwood has made her position clear. Any further harassment will be dealt with according to territorial law." "This isn't over," Reginald said, though his voice now carried the desperation of a man who recognized defeat. "I have connections, Eleanor. I can make life difficult for you and your husband in ways you can't imagine." Clayton's hand moved to his father's Colt, .45. though he made no move to draw the weapon. "Mr. Ashworth, I suggest you reconsider making threats against my wife. In Philadelphia, you might have social weapons at your disposal. Out here, men settle their differences more directly, and I was raised to protect what matters to me." The implied challenge hung in the air as Sheriff Martinez firmly guided the two visitors toward the door. Detective Morrison offered apologetic nods to Judge Blackstone and Clayton, clearly embarrassed by his client's behavior and eager to conclude their business in Silver Creek. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Eleanor and Clayton stood together in the parlor, surrounded by the debris of confrontation, but also by the certainty that their marriage had been tested and proven strong. Judge Blackstone gathered his papers with satisfaction, clearly pleased with the outcome. "Mrs. Blackwood," the judge said as he prepared to leave, "your teaching slate demonstration was particularly effective. Written testimony carries considerable weight in legal proceedings, and your clear statement of choice will be on record should Mr. Ashworth attempt to pursue this matter further." Eleanor looked at the slate where her declaration remained visible, then at Clayton, whose expression combined relief, admiration, and unmistakable love. "Your Honor, I wrote the truth. Clayton has given me a partnership based on respect and equality. No amount of social pressure or legal maneuvering could convince me to abandon what we've built together." When they were finally alone, Eleanor and Clayton stood facing each other in the parlor, where their practical arrangement had been tested and transformed into something much deeper. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the room where they had fought for their right to choose their own future. "It's over," Clayton said, though his voice suggested amazement that they had survived the crisis. "No," Eleanor replied, moving into his arms for the first time since their wedding day. "It's just beginning." 6 months after Reginald Ashworth's defeated departure from Silver Creek, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the completed schoolhouse, watching her students work on their end-of-term examinations. The building that Clayton had commissioned as a wedding gift gleamed with fresh paint and proper furnishings, individual desks instead of shared benches, a blackboard that covered most of one wall, and windows positioned to provide excellent natural light throughout the day. Most precious of all was the brass bell mounted in the small tower, whose clear voice called children to learning each morning and marked the rhythm of their educational progress. The transformation in her students amazed even Eleanor, who had always believed in the potential that education could unlock. Tommy Henderson, whose mathematical aptitude had first caught Clayton's attention, was now helping younger children with arithmetic problems that would have baffled him months earlier. Sarah Mitchell's daughter Mary had progressed from barely recognizing letters to reading entire paragraphs from McGuffey's Third Reader. Even the older children, who had initially resisted formal schooling as impractical, now understood that education would expand their opportunities beyond the limited options that frontier life traditionally provided. "Mrs. Blackwood," called 8-year-old Timothy Morrison, "I finished my composition about what I want to be when I grow up. May I read it to the class?" Eleanor nodded encouragement, knowing that Timothy's confidence in public speaking was one of many transformations that proper education had fostered. As he stood to read his carefully written paragraphs about becoming a teacher himself, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of professional fulfillment. The schoolhouse represented more than educational achievement, symbolized the community's investment in its own future and its acceptance of Eleanor as someone whose contributions mattered beyond her role as Clayton's wife. Parents who had initially viewed formal education with skepticism now spoke proudly of their children's progress and planned their family schedules around school attendance. The transformation had required patience, diplomacy, and countless small demonstrations that learning enhanced rather than threatened the practical skills that frontier survival demanded. After dismissing the children for their summer recess, Eleanor walked slowly through the empty classroom, straightening desks and organizing materials for the fall term when enrollment would expand to include children from neighboring settlements. The work brought deep satisfaction, not just the visible evidence of learning, but the knowledge that she had helped plant seeds that would continue growing long after individual students had moved on to adult responsibilities. Clayton appeared in the doorway, his presence announced by the familiar sound of his boots on the wooden floor. 6 months of marriage had taught Eleanor to recognize his footsteps, his breathing patterns, and the subtle changes in his voice that indicated whether he brought good news, concerns, or simply the desire for her company. "How were the examinations?" he asked, settling into the chair that Eleanor kept for adult visitors who came to discuss their children's progress. "Remarkable," Eleanor replied honestly. "Every child has exceeded my expectations, and several have progressed far enough to begin planning for advanced education if their families can support it." Clayton's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications. Advanced education would mean sending them away to established schools in California or back east. That's a significant investment for farming families. "I know. But Clayton, these children have potential that shouldn't be wasted simply because they were born in a small frontier community. With proper preparation, some of them could become teachers, doctors, lawyers, or engineers. They could return to serve communities like ours, or they could succeed in larger cities, if that's what they choose." Eleanor's passion for her students' futures was one of the qualities that Clayton had come to love most deeply about his wife. Her investment in their success went far beyond professional duties, genuinely cared about each child's individual potential, and worked tirelessly to help them achieve goals that their parents had never imagined possible. "What would it take to provide that advanced preparation?" Clayton asked. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out toward the ranch house where their own future was still being written. A high school curriculum, probably. Advanced mathematics, science, literature, and languages that would prepare them for university entrance examinations. It would require additional teachers and resources that our current budget couldn't support. But if those resources were available— Eleanor turned to face her husband, recognizing the tone that indicated he was developing plans that would probably surprise her. "Clayton, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Silver Creek Academy has a nice sound to it," he replied with the smile that never failed to warm Eleanor's heart. "A proper secondary school that could serve students throughout the territory, with boarding facilities for those who live too far away for daily attendance." Eleanor felt her breath catch at the scope of what he was suggesting. "Clayton, that would be an enormous undertaking. The expense alone would be manageable if the purpose justified the investment." Clayton interrupted gently. "Eleanor, what we've built here, our marriage, your school, the community's growth has shown me that some investments pay dividends that can't be measured in purely financial terms. Giving these children opportunities for advanced education would benefit not just individual families, but the entire territory as it develops toward statehood." Eleanor moved to the desk where she kept her lesson plans and pulled out a folder containing correspondence from universities and colleges that had begun recruiting qualified students from Western territories. The letters represented possibilities that she had hardly dared consider, but that Clayton's proposal would make realistic options for her most promising students. "I've been thinking about this for months," she admitted, "but I thought it was too ambitious, too expensive, too complicated for a community like ours to support." Clayton joined her at the desk, studying the correspondence with the careful attention he brought to all business decisions. "Eleanor, 6 months ago I was a lonely man whose wealth meant nothing because I had no one to share it with. You've given me purpose and partnership that has transformed my understanding of what makes life meaningful. If I can use my resources to help you transform the educational opportunities available to children throughout this territory, then my father's mining fortune will finally serve a purpose worthy of the work that created it." That evening, as they sat in their library discussing plans for the proposed academy, Eleanor found herself marveling at the journey that had brought them from a practical arrangement to a partnership built on love, respect, and shared commitment to values larger than their individual needs. "Clayton," she said during a pause in their planning, "do you remember what you said in your original proposal, that you were offering a practical arrangement that would benefit both parties?" "I remember," Clayton replied, his voice carrying warmth that spoke of deep contentment. I also remember thinking I was being quite generous and far-sighted in my terms. Eleanor laughed, the sound filling the book-lined room with joy that would have seemed impossible during their carefully polite early weeks together. You had no idea what you were actually offering, did you? None whatsoever. Clayton agreed. I thought I was hiring a companion who would help fill the empty spaces in this house. Instead, I found a partner who filled empty spaces in my life that I hadn't even recognized. Eleanor moved to the window where she had stood on so many evenings, looking out toward the town where her students lived and learned and grew toward futures that would carry them far beyond the circumstances of their birth. The view still included the boarding house where she had faced the crisis that led to Clayton's proposal, but now it also encompassed the schoolhouse where she had found her life's work and the community that had become her chosen family. In her jewelry box upstairs lay the simple gold wedding ring that Clayton had crafted himself during the weeks following their confrontation with Reginald, not because their original arrangement required it, but because he wanted to replace the practical contract of their early marriage with a symbol of chosen commitment and enduring love. Eleanor wore it every day now, not as a sign of possession, but as a reminder that the best partnerships grow from respect, nurture each other's dreams, and create something larger than what either person could accomplish alone. Mrs. Blackwood, Clayton said formally, using the title that had once felt strange but now carried the weight of shared history and mutual choice. Are you ready to build a school that will educate the next generation of territorial leaders? Mr. Blackwood, Eleanor replied with equal formality but sparkling eyes, I thought you'd never ask. Outside their window, the first stars appeared in the clear desert sky, marking the end of another day in the life they had chosen together, and the beginning of plans that would shape their community's future for generations to come. The practical arrangement that had brought them together had evolved into something neither had dared hope, for a love story written in the careful details of daily partnership, mutual respect, and shared commitment to making their corner of the world a little better than they had found it.